The scratching of my pen sounded like a knife against crystal. My parents beamed at my brother as if he had won a prize, not robbed me blind. They believe I surrendered my $2.5 million penthouse for family honor, but the ink has not even dried, and the trap I set 8 months ago has snapped shut. The man who will destroy their fantasy is not me, but my brother's own arrogant lawyer sitting right beside him. My name is Ruth Oakmont. And for the last hour, I had been calculating the depreciation of my own dignity in a room that smelled of stale coffee and expensive leather. I sat perfectly still in the high-backed chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching the 3 people who were supposed to be my family dissect my life as if it were a carcass on a butcher's table. We were on the 42nd floor of a glass monolith in the financial district of San Francisco, the office of my family's longtime attorney. But the air in the room felt as heavy and suffocating as a crypt. Across the mahogany table sat my brother, Julian, at 29 years old. He still wore the expression of a misunderstood toddler who had just broken a vase. He slumped in his chair, picking at a loose thread on his Italian suit jacket. A suit that I knew cost $3,000 because I was the one who had paid the credit card bill for it 2 months ago. It wasn't my fault. "Ruthie," he whined, his voice grating against my nerves. The market crashed. Nobody saw the regulation coming. My entire crypto portfolio was wiped out in 48 hours. I just need a restart. You know how it is. I knew exactly how it was. I knew that his project had not been a victim of market forces, but a result of his own incompetence and a gambling addiction he masqueraded as investment strategy. But I said nothing. I just looked at him, then at my parents flanking him like protective gargoyles. "You are the eldest, Ruth," my mother said, her voice dripping with that cloying sweetness she reserved for moments when she was twisting a knife. She reached out and patted Julian's hand. Ignoring the fact that he was a grown man who had just torched $500,000 of investor money, "You have been so fortunate in your career. You have your firm. You have so much surplus. It is only right that you help your brother get back on his feet. We cannot let people whisper that the Vance family leaves their own behind." My father nodded solemnly, refusing to meet my eyes. He stared out the window at the fog rolling over the bay. "Think of the family honor. Ruth, Julian needs a base of operations. A place that commands respect so he can secure new partners. That apartment of yours at Obsidian Heights is perfect. You are rarely there anyway." I felt a cold tightness in my chest. They were not asking for a loan. They were demanding a sacrifice. The Obsidian Heights penthouse was not just an apartment. It was a $2.5 million sanctuary I had bought with my own money. Money earned from 10 years of grueling work as a valuation expert. Digging through the wreckage of bankrupt companies, it was the first thing I had ever owned that they had not touched. "And the jewelry," my mother added, almost as an afterthought, though her eyes betrayed a sharp greed. "The emerald brooches your grandmother left. Julian can use them as collateral for a bridge loan. Just until he is liquid again." My breath hitched. The emeralds were not just assets. They were the only things my grandmother had left specifically to me, hidden away from my parents because she knew exactly who they were. She had pressed them into my hands a week before she died, telling me they were my safety net. Now, my mother was demanding I hand them over to the son she had coddled into uselessness. "We really should expedite this." A smooth baritone voice cut through the tension. Derek Thorne, Julian's lawyer, tapped his gold watch significantly. He was a man who wore arrogance like a second skin, his smile practiced and empty. "The transfer documents are prepared. It is a simple quitclaim deed for the property and a transfer of ownership for the chattels. The sooner you sign, Ms. Oakmont, the sooner we can avoid any messy legal entanglements regarding your brother's previous creditors. It is the best way to protect the family assets." Protect the family assets. That was a rich way of saying rob the daughter to save the son. I looked down at the documents spread out before me. The text was dense, but I did not need to read every word to know what it said. It was a total surrender. A complete transfer of the penthouse and the jewelry to Julian Vance. Free and clear. I let my shoulders slump. I forced my lower lip to tremble just slightly. I had practiced this moment in the mirror for weeks. Ever since I found the listening device Julian had clumsily hidden in my office to monitor my finances. They wanted a defeated daughter, so I would give them one. I reached for the heavy fountain pen Thorne offered. My hand shook, a physical manifestation of the anxiety they thought they were inflicting on me. "You are sure?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I looked at my father, then my mother. "You are absolutely sure this is what you want? You want me to transfer the title directly to Julian's personal name? Not a trust? Not a joint ownership?" "Of course," my father snapped, his patience wearing thin. "He needs the assets in his name to show solvency to the banks. Don't be difficult. Ruth, do not make this harder than it needs to be." Julian smirked. It was a small, fleeting expression, but I saw it. His eyes lit up with the anticipation of the windfall. He was already spending the money in his head, imagining the parties he would throw in my living room, the way he would flaunt the view of the Golden Gate Bridge to his friends. "It is for the best." "Ruthie," Julian said, leaning forward, "I will take good care of the place. I promise." I looked at him one last time. I remembered the 3 jobs I worked in college while he crashed brand-new sports cars. I remembered the tuition checks my parents refused to write for me because they were saving for his private school. I remembered the silence of my apartment, the peace I had built brick by brick. Then, I looked at the signature line. "Very well," I said softly. I pressed the nib to the paper. I did not sign with the hesitation I had feigned a moment ago. I signed with a sharp, fluid motion, the ink flowing black and permanent. I signed the property deed. Then I signed the transfer for the emeralds. I capped the pen with a decisive click that echoed in the silent room. Thorne snatched the papers away the second I lifted my hand, as if he were afraid I would change my mind. He quickly scanned the signatures, a triumphant grin spreading across his face. He nodded to my parents. "Done and done," Thorne announced. "Congratulations, Julian. You are now the owner of one of the finest properties in San Francisco." My mother let out a sigh of relief, the tension leaving her shoulders. She stood up and hugged Julian, ignoring me completely. "I knew you would do the right thing," she murmured to him. I stood up. I smoothed the creases of my skirt. My face was dry. There were no tears, no hysterics. The crushing weight I expected to feel was absent. Instead, I felt a strange, cold lightness. I picked up my purse. They were already celebrating, discussing dinner plans at a steakhouse I was paying for but was certainly not invited to. "I hope Julian is strong enough to carry the weight of this gift," I said. My voice was steady, cutting through their chatter. They stopped and looked at me, confused by the tone. It wasn't the voice of a victim. It was the voice of an appraiser who had just finalized a transaction. My father frowned. "What is that supposed to mean?" I didn't answer. I just turned my back on them. I walked out of the conference room, past the glass walls, and toward the elevator. I left them there with the champagne corks popping in their minds, unaware that the ink on the paper they were holding was not a victory treaty, but a death warrant for their financial future. The leather steering wheel of my Audi felt cool under my palms as I navigated the winding streets of San Francisco. The city was bathed in the gray, diffused light of the late afternoon fog. A weather pattern I had always found comforting. It hid things. It muffled the noise. I was not driving toward the sad, cramping rental apartment in the Tenderloin that I had told my parents I would be staying in to save money. I was heading toward the Marina District, to a 3-bedroom condo with a private roof deck that I had purchased 6 months ago through a shell company. My family thought I was destitute, a woman stripped of her assets and forced into humility. They did not know that Ruth Oakmont never played a game without holding an ace up her sleeve. As I waited at a red light on Lombard Street, the silence of the car allowed the ghosts of the past to slide into the passenger seat. I was 18 years old again. Standing in the kitchen of our childhood home in Palo Alto, I was holding a thick envelope with the crimson seal of Harvard University. My hands had been shaking then. not from fear, but from pure, unadulterated joy. I had done it. I had studied by flashlight while Julian threw parties downstairs. I had aced every test, captained the debate team, and scrubbed the floors to keep my mother happy. But when I showed them the letter, my father did not pop champagne. He did not even smile. He just sighed, a long, weary sound that deflated my entire world. "We cannot afford the tuition." "Ruth," he had said, not looking up from his newspaper. I had brought out my spreadsheets. I showed them the financial aid, the work-study options. I only needed them to cover the gap, a gap that was significantly less than the cost of the renovations they were doing on the pool house. "We have to prioritize," my mother had interjected, pouring herself a glass of Chardonnay. "Julian is starting at St. Ignatius next fall. Private school is not cheap, and you know your brother needs specialized attention to thrive. He is fragile. Ruth, you are strong. You can go to state college. It is the same degree in the end." I went to state college. I worked 3 jobs: barista at dawn, library archivist at lunch, and tutor at night, to pay for my books and rent. I graduated with 0 debt and a 4.0 GPA. Julian? He got a brand new cherry red sports car for his 16th birthday because my parents felt guilty that he was failing algebra. He crashed it into a fire hydrant 2 weeks later. My father bought him another one to cheer him up. That was the dynamic. I was the plow horse, bred to work until I dropped. Julian was the show pony, preened and polished even though he could not run a single lap. The only person who saw me was my grandmother, Nana Rose. She was a sharp-tongued woman who smoked slim cigarettes and hid her disdain for her daughter, my mother, behind clouds of smoke. When she died 5 years ago, the family went into a frenzy searching for her jewels. They found nothing. They did not know that 3 days before she passed, she had pressed a heavy velvet pouch into my hands and given me the key to a small safety deposit box. "They will squander it. Ruthie," she had wheezed, gripping my hand with surprising strength. "Your mother has a hole in her soul that she tries to fill with things, and your brother is a bottomless pit. Take this. Use it to build something they cannot touch." Inside that box was the Emerald Collection and a trust fund she had secretly compounded for 20 years. It was not a fortune, but it was enough. It was the seed money for Oakmont valuations. I used that money to build a reputation as the most ruthless asset valuation expert on the West Coast. I learned to look at a crumbling business or a divorcing couple's estate and see exactly what it was worth down to the penny. I became rich because I understood that value is rarely about the object itself. It is about the desperation of the person holding it. My family, however, only saw my success as a safety net for Julian's failures. And there were so many failures. There was the craft beer bar that never opened because Julian spent the capital on a trip to Ibiza. There was the custom car shop where he accidentally sold a client's car without the title. There was the multi-level marketing scheme involving essential oils that left our parents' garage filled with unsellable inventory. Every single time, I was summoned. "Ruth, fix the tax lien. Ruth, negotiate with the landlord. Ruth, pay the settlement so your brother does not go to jail." And I did it. I did it because I was conditioned to seek their approval, a hunger that never went away no matter how much money I made. Until a year ago, I bought the Penthouse at Obsidian Heights. It was my masterpiece, high above the city, with walls of glass and floors of Italian marble. It was a symbol that I had transcended them. The ink was barely dry on the deed when my mother suggested Julian move in. "He is going through a hard time," she had said. "He needs a stable address. It would be fun. Like a sleepover." I refused. For the first time in my life, I gave them a hard no. I locked the doors and kept my sanctuary pure. But Julian was a cancer that metastasized. 6 months ago, his latest venture, a cryptocurrency arbitrage bot, imploded, but this time, he had not just lost my parents' money. He had borrowed from loan sharks disguised as private equity investors. And he had leveraged himself to the hilt with high-interest bank loans using forged cosigner documents. When the collectors started calling, my parents did not blame Julian. They panicked. They looked at the $2.5 million of equity sitting in my penthouse and saw their salvation. Sell the apartment. Ruth. My father had demanded over a dinner where I was not allowed to eat until I agreed. Pay off his debts. We will pay you back eventually. I refused again. Then came the threats. The emotional blackmail. They told me I was cold. Ungrateful. Unnatural. They threatened to write me out of their wills. An empty threat, as they had nothing left, and to cut me off from all family gatherings. But the breaking point was not their words. It was a Tuesday in November. I had been in Tokyo for a week, appraising a tech conglomerate's assets. I came home to Obsidian Heights exhausted, craving nothing but silence and a hot bath. When I opened the door, the smell hit me first. Stale beer, cheap marijuana, vomit. My pristine white sofas were stained with wine. There were strangers passed out on my rug. And there, in the center of the room, wearing my silk robe, was Julian, holding court with a group of sycophants, laughing about how his tight-ass sister was paying for everything. He had stolen my spare emergency key from my office when he came to beg for lunch money a week prior. I did not scream. I did not throw them out immediately. I stood in the shadows of the hallway and watched him. I watched the brother I had protected for 30 years as he ashed a cigarette on my grandmother's antique table. He didn't just feel entitled to my money. He felt entitled to my existence. He believed that everything I built was merely a reservoir for him to drain. That was the moment the sister died, and the valuation expert took over. I realized then that my family was a liability that needed to be liquidated. So when they proposed the transfer scheme, transfer the deed to Julian so he could use the asset to secure a massive new loan to pay off the sharks and start over, I didn't fight them. I let them think they had worn me down. I let them think I was the sacrificial lamb. I pulled my car into the underground garage of my secret condo. The heavy gate rattled shut behind me, sealing out the world. I turned off the engine and sat in the darkness for a moment. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Julian. "Hey sis, the movers are taking too long. Can you come help pack? Also, where is the manual for the jacuzzi?" I looked at the message and felt a cold. Sharp smile cut across my face. I stepped out of the car, my heels clicking against the concrete. Let him enjoy the jacuzzi. Let him enjoy the view. He had no idea that he had just moved into a glass cage, and I was the one holding the only key to the exit. To understand how I walked out of that law office with a smile instead of a scream. You have to rewind the clock. The architectural blueprints for my revenge were not drawn up overnight. They were drafted exactly 6 months prior. On a rainy Tuesday morning in the private library of the Titan Club, I was sitting across from Lydia Sterling. Lydia was 60 years old, wore tailored silk suits that cost more than most cars, and possessed a legal mind so sharp it could cut diamonds. She had been my mentor when I first started in valuation, teaching me that every asset has a skeleton in its closet if you look hard enough. I had laid out the entire situation for her. The emotional blackmail, the threats from my parents, the inevitable demand that I hand over my hard-earned life to salvage Julian's wreckage. I do not just want to say no. Lydia, I had told her, my voice steady despite the rage burning in my gut. If I just say no, they will harass me forever. They will guilt me until I break. I need to give them exactly what they want, but I need it to be the thing that finally destroys their delusions. I want to sever the limb to save the body. Lydia had sipped her espresso, her gray eyes glittering with predatory amusement. "You want a Trojan horse," she stated. "You want to wheel a beautiful gift inside their gates. Let them celebrate, and then let the soldiers out to slaughter them while they sleep." "Exactly," I replied. We started with due diligence. If I was going to go to war, I needed to know the enemy's terrain. I hired a forensic accountant to look into Julian's finances, far deeper than the surface-level debts my parents knew about. What we found was not just incompetence, it was criminal. Julian was not just losing money on crypto, he was moving money. He had been funneling cash through a series of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Caymans. It looked suspiciously like he was washing money for online gambling syndicates. And the most beautiful part was that the Internal Revenue Service had already flagged 2 of his associated entities for an audit. Julian did not know it yet, but the federal government was already sharpening its knives. This changed everything. It meant that any asset Julian touched would become radioactive. "We have to insulate you," Lydia warned. "If you transfer the penthouse directly, and the IRS seizes it, they might try to claw back to you, unless the transfer itself is the trap." That was the moment Operation Trojan was born. Step 1 was the real estate itself. My penthouse at Obsidian Heights was technically owned by me, but I carried a mortgage on it to keep my liquidity free for investments. I went to my bank, a boutique lender where I had significant leverage. I requested a loan restructuring. I converted the standard residential mortgage into a specialized commercial instrument. Buried deep in the 40-page agreement was a toxicity clause known as an acceleration trigger. It stated that if the title of the property was transferred to any party without a full independent credit reevaluation by the lender, the interest rate would not just adjust, it would uncap. It would jump from a manageable 3% to a punitive floating rate of 18%, retroactive to the date of transfer. Furthermore, the new owner would be personally liable for the entire principal balance immediately upon any default in monthly payments. Julian, with his credit score in the gutter, would never pass that reevaluation, but he would be too arrogant to read the fine print before accepting the deed. Step 2 was the masterstroke. I needed to control the battlefield. I formed a limited liability company called Nemesis Holdings. I used a complex chain of trust to ensure my name appeared nowhere on the paperwork. Nemesis Holdings then approached the developer of Obsidian Heights. The developer was cash poor and looking to offload the management rights for the building. I bought them, for a surprisingly reasonable sum. Nemesis Holdings became the exclusive property management firm for Obsidian Heights. This gave me, or rather, the faceless entity I controlled, absolute power over the building's bylaws. I tightened the regulations immediately. I implemented draconian fines for noise violations, unauthorized guests, and structural damages. I introduced a special assessment fee for facade maintenance, payable by all unit owners, effective immediately upon change of ownership. By the time Julian moved in, he would not just be an owner, he would be a tenant in a building run by a landlord designed to destroy him. Step 3 concerned the emeralds. My mother wanted them so Julian could use them as collateral. She saw them as shiny rocks with a price tag. I took the brooches to a heritage specialist in Sacramento. We spent weeks documenting their provenance. We proved that the emeralds were part of a specific historical set commissioned in the 1920s by a famous artisan. I successfully petitioned to have the collection registered as a cultural heritage asset of state significance. This designation came with a catch that my family would never suspect. It meant the items could not be sold across state lines. They could not be altered. And most importantly, they could not be sold commercially without a special permit that took 6 months to process. If anyone tried to sell them on the black market or pawn them, it would instantly trigger a felony alert for trafficking protected cultural goods. I was handing Julian a grenade, and if he tried to pull the pin by selling them, it would blow up in his face. The final layer of the trap was surveillance. 2 weeks before the signing ceremony, I had a team of technicians install a state-of-the-art smart home system in the penthouse. I told my parents I was upgrading the place to increase its value before the transfer. I put sensors everywhere. In the smoke detectors, in the thermostat, in the recessed lighting. I installed high-fidelity audio receivers in the living room and master bedroom, ostensibly for voice-activated commands. However, the system had a back door. All data, including audio recordings and video feeds from the security system, was not just stored locally, it was mirrored in real time to a private server in a data center in Nevada. Paid for by Nemesis Holdings, I set up specific triggers. If the decibel level went above a certain threshold after 10 at night, the system would log a noise violation. If the smoke detectors sensed anything other than culinary smoke, say illegal substances, it would timestamp the air quality report. I was not just giving him a home, I was putting him in a glass jar where every mistake, every crime, and every conversation would be recorded, cataloged, and prepared for litigation. By the time I sat in that conference room with my parents, I was not afraid. I was barely suppressing a laugh. I looked at the documents Thorne had prepared, and I saw the gaping holes in his defense. He was a lazy lawyer, used to bullying people into submission. He had not bothered to check the title encumbrances. He had not checked the building management status. He had definitely not run a heritage check on the jewelry. He thought he was taking a queen off the chessboard. He did not realize I had already rigged the entire board to conduct electricity. When I signed my name, I was not signing away my future. I was signing the opening move of a demolition project. I was handing Julian the keys to a kingdom that was rigged to collapse the moment he stepped inside. And the beauty of it was, he had demanded it. He had begged for it. He wanted the life of a rich man. I was going to make sure he paid the full price for it. 3 days had passed since the ink dried on the transfer deed, and the silence in my penthouse was absolute. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. Heavy and electrically charged. I moved through the rooms of the apartment at Obsidian Heights like a ghost haunting her own life, systematically dismantling the evidence of my existence here. I had been packing since dawn, but my luggage was surprisingly light. I was taking only my clothes, my books, and my personal hard drives. Everything else stayed. That had been my mother's specific instruction, delivered with a smile that she probably thought was comforting but looked more like a threat. "Leave the furniture. Ruthie," she had said, "Julian does not have time to shop for new things, and your taste is so professional, it will give him a head start." So I left the Italian leather sectional that had taken 4 months to ship from Milan. I left the hand-carved dining table made of reclaimed walnut. I left the 80-inch television and the surround sound system. I looked at these objects, things I had worked thousands of billable hours to afford, and felt absolutely nothing. They were just props now, stage dressing for the tragedy my brother was about to perform. However, there was one substitution I had to make. I stood in the hallway, looking at the abstract expressionist painting I had purchased at a gallery in Soho 2 years ago. It was a chaotic, vibrant piece that I loved, carefully, wearing white cotton gloves. I lifted it from the wall and slid it into a protective crate marked for storage. In its place, I hung a reproduction I had ordered online for $40. From a distance, it looked identical. Up close, the brushstrokes were flat, mere pixels printed on canvas. Julian would never know the difference. To him, art was just something to cover a blank space on the wall. I did the same for the sculpture in the foyer and the lithographs in the guest bedroom. By the time I was finished, the apartment was a gallery of fakes, a perfect reflection of its new owner. My phone buzzed on the marble counter, vibrating against the stone with an angry intensity. I glanced at the screen. It was Julian. "Hurry up. The guys are coming over at 8 for the housewarming. I need the place clear." I did not reply. I simply deleted the message. He was kicking me out of my own home to throw a party for people who likely only liked him because he was buying the drinks. The entitlement was so thick I could almost taste it in the air, metallic and bitter. I walked to the control panel of the smart home system mounted near the kitchen. This was the nerve center of the trap I had laid in Part 3. I tapped the screen, entering the administrator code that only I knew. The interface blinked green. Every sensor was active. The noise monitors were calibrated. The smoke detectors were sensitive enough to detect a cigarette lit 3 rooms away. The hidden cameras in the living areas, legally permissible for security purposes, were streaming directly to the Nemesis holding server. I set the thermostat to a neutral 70 degrees, knowing full well that I had programmed a randomizer algorithm to kick in at midnight that would fluctuate the temperature between freezing and sweltering. It was a petty touch, I admitted to myself, but I wanted his comfort to be as eroded as his finances. With the apartment prepped, I had one final piece of business before I left the building. I took the elevator down to the lobby, the smooth descent feeling like a countdown. When the doors opened, I walked straight to the property manager's office. Mr. Henderson was a fastidious man, the kind of person who ironed his socks. He had been managing Obsidian Heights for 3 years, but he had only been working for me, unknowingly at first, and then explicitly via Nemesis Holdings, for the last 6 months. I closed the door behind me. "Ms. Oakmont," Henderson said, standing up and smoothing his tie. "Is everything ready for the handover?" "Everything is proceeding exactly as planned," I said, keeping my voice low. "The new owner moves in tonight. You have the updated protocols from Nemesis Holdings?" He nodded, tapping a thick folder on his desk. "I do. The new ownership directive is very specific." I leaned forward, resting my hands on his desk. "I want you to follow those directives to the letter. Mr. Henderson, specifically the clause regarding the solvency verification for new residents. It states that any change in unit ownership requires an immediate audit of the new owner's liquidity to ensure they can meet the monthly assessment fees." Henderson adjusted his glasses. "That is a standard clause, usually waived for family transfers. Not this time," I said coldly. "Nemesis Holdings does not recognize family discounts. The new owner has a history of financial instability. Trigger the audit tomorrow morning. Send him the demand for 6 months of maintenance fees up front. If he misses the deadline by even 1 hour, initiate the lien process." Henderson looked at me, a flicker of understanding passing behind his eyes. He knew Julian. He had seen my brother try to park his car in the fire lane and berate the doorman. He did not like Julian. "Understood. Ms. Oakmont," he said, "we will run a tight ship." "Thank you." I went back up to the penthouse for the final time. My suitcases were by the door. I did not look back at the view of the Golden Gate Bridge. I had memorized it, and I would find a better view elsewhere. My phone rang again. This time it was my mother. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Part of me, the small, stupid part that still lived in the past, hoped she was calling to see if I was okay, to ask where I was going to sleep tonight, to say thank you. I answered, "Hello, Mother. Ruth, thank God," she said, her voice breathless and rushed. "We are just leaving the club. Julian is already on his way. Listen, you did leave the combination for the wall safe, didn't you? The one in the master closet?" I closed my eyes. Of course, that was all it was. "I am texting it to Julian right now." I said, "Good," she said. "He needs to secure some things. Make sure you are gone before he gets there. Ruth, he wants to start fresh without any bad energy." Bad energy. That was what she called me. I hung up without saying goodbye. I typed the combination into a message and hit send. Inside that safe, nestled in its velvet box, was the Emerald Collection, the cultural heritage assets. I had placed them there 10 minutes ago. I could have taken them. I could have hidden them. But they were the cheese in the mousetrap. Julian needed quick cash. He would see those emeralds not as heirlooms, but as a quick $50,000 from a shady pawnbroker. By leaving them, I was giving him the means to commit a federal crime. I was practically handing him the shovel to dig his own grave. I grabbed the handle of my suitcase. The apartment was silent, but the sensors were watching. The trap was set. The bait was laid. The contract was a ticking time bomb. I walked out the front door and let it click shut behind me. The sound was final. It was the sound of a vault locking. Down in the garage, I loaded my bags into my car. I sat in the driver's seat and looked up at the towering glass spire of Obsidian Heights. The lights in the penthouse were off. In an hour, they would be blazing. Music would be thumping. Champagne would be spilling on the floors I had paid to polish. I put the car in gear. "Goodbye, Julian," I whispered to the empty garage. "And good luck. You are going to need it." I drove out into the San Francisco night, leaving the wreckage of my family behind me, waiting for the first explosion. I sat in the darkness of my new living room, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face like a phantom. I had a glass of vintage Pinot Noir in my hand, a bottle I had wisely removed from the Penthouse wine cellar before vacating, and a bowl of popcorn on the table. It was 8 o'clock in the evening. The show was about to begin. On my screen, a grid of 12 high-definition video feeds displayed every corner of my former home. The audio was crisp. picking up the clinking of glasses and the thumping bass of electronic dance music that Julian had started blasting the moment he walked through the door. It was grotesque. It was fascinating. It was like watching a nature documentary about a species distinct for its lack of survival instincts. Julian had wasted no time. Less than 6 hours after I handed over the keys, the penthouse was filled with about 30 people. I recognized none of them. They looked like the cast of a reality show that had been canceled after the pilot episode. Too much spray tan, too many teeth, and clothes that cost more than their education. My brother stood in the center of the living room, purely on my imported wool rug and his muddy shoes. He held a magnum of champagne that I knew for a fact had been a gift from one of my corporate clients 3 years ago. "To new beginnings," Julian shouted, spraying foam over the furniture I had left behind. "To the Oakmont Empire." The crowd cheered. I watched as Julian puffed out his chest, looking around the room with the swagger of a man who had conquered a nation, rather than a beggar who had been handed a kingdom out of pity. "This place is insane, bro," one of his friends yelled over the music. "How did you pull this off?" "I thought you were tapped out on that crypto crash." Julian laughed. A loud braying sound. That was just a strategic dip. You have to know when to hold and when to fold. I moved some assets around. Leveraged my portfolio. You know how it is. My sister was just squatting here, keeping the seat warm until the real player was ready to take over. I took a sip of wine, savoring the dryness on my tongue. The real player. The man had to ask me for gas money last week. Then, the camera in the foyer triggered. My parents had arrived. I leaned forward. This was the part I had been dreading, yet needing to see. My mother walked in, her eyes scanning the room not with disapproval at the noise or the strangers, but with pure, unadulterated pride. My father clapped Julian on the back, beaming. "This is it, son," my father said, his voice captured clearly by the microphone hidden in the sconce. "This is where you belong, a commanding view for a commanding future." My mother wandered over to the window, looking out at the city lights. "It feels so much better in here already." She sighed. When Ruth was here, it always felt so sterile, cold. She never knew how to fill a home with life. You have brought warmth to it. Julian, I felt a phantom ache in my chest, a small bruise where my heart used to be. I had filled that home with peace. I had filled it with the quiet satisfaction of independence, but to them, anything that did not revolve around their golden boy was simply empty space. The night wore on. The alcohol flowed. Around 11 o'clock, the atmosphere shifted from celebratory to sloppy. Julian, clearly intoxicated on his own ego, led a young woman into the master bedroom. She was a waif of a girl with bleached hair and eyes that scanned the room for price tags. He steered her toward the walk-in closet. I watched as he fumbled with the wall safe. He tapped in the code I had sent him. My birthday, ironically, and the heavy door swung open. He reached inside and pulled out the velvet box containing grandmother's emeralds. I held my breath. "Check this out." Julian slurred, opening the box. "Family heirlooms, worth a fortune." The girl gasped, her fingers immediately reaching out to touch the necklace. It was a stunning piece, Art Deco, platinum and emeralds that shimmered like captured forest light. She draped it around her neck, preening in the mirror. "It is gorgeous," she cooed, "but it is kind of old-fashioned. You know what would look better on me?" "What?" Julian asked, mesmerized by her reflection, or perhaps just his own proximity to it. "A G-Wagon." She giggled. "A white one," Julian laughed, grabbing the brooch from the box. He tossed it in the air and caught it. "You want a car? Babe, this is just a rock. I can sell this junk tomorrow. I know a guy in the mission who pays cash for antique scraps. We will get you that car." "I promise," Julian said, leaning in to kiss her neck. "Consider it done. We will auction off these old things and get some real toys." "Gotcha," I whispered to the empty room. The recording was saved. He had just stated his intent to sell a registered cultural heritage asset without a permit. He had just conspired to liquidate collateral that did not technically belong to him yet in the eyes of the Heritage Board. It was time to ruin the mood. I opened the Nemesis Holdings control app on my laptop. I navigated to the HVAC settings. The current temperature in the penthouse was a comfortable 72 degrees. I dragged the slider down, way down. I set the target temperature to 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, I accessed the lighting protocols. I programmed the recessed lights in the living room and kitchen to flicker at irregular intervals, a subtle strobe effect designed to induce nausea and anxiety. On the screen, the reaction was slow but inevitable. Within 20 minutes, guests started rubbing their arms. The girl in the bedroom shivered and pulled a duvet around herself. "Why is it so cold?" someone complained in the living room. Julian stumbled to the thermostat. I watched him jab at the buttons. "It is just a glitch," he muttered. "Stupid high-tech junk." He tried to turn it up. I overrode his command instantly. Locking the interface, the temperature continued to drop. Then, I initiated the playlist. It was 3 a.m. The party was dying down. Guests passing out on the sofas. I selected a track I had uploaded specifically for this moment, Wagner's Ride of the Valkyries, but a distorted version where the bass was boosted to a level that would rattle teeth. I hit play. Volume, 100%. The apartment erupted. Even through my laptop speakers, it was loud. On the video feed, people bolted upright, clutching their ears. Julian was running around frantically, screaming at the walls, trying to find the source of the sound. "Make it stop!" the girlfriend shrieked. I let it play for exactly 10 minutes before cutting it to silence. Then, I waited 5 minutes, let them drift back to sleep, and blasted it again. By 4 a.m, the party had dispersed. The guests fled the haunted icebox, leaving Julian shivering alone in the middle of his empire, wrapped in 3 blankets, cursing my name. The fallout began at sunrise. I switched the camera view to the hallway outside the penthouse. At 9 o'clock sharp, the elevator doors opened. A uniformed staff member from the building management office stepped out. He carried a cream-colored envelope sealed with the Obsidian's Heights insignia. He slid the envelope under the door. This was the first strike, a formal citation for excessive noise, unauthorized gathering, and violation of the quiet enjoyment clause of the building bylaws. It carried a fine of $500. On the interior camera, I saw Julian wake up. He looked terrible, eyes bloodshot, skin pale from the cold. He shuffled to the door and saw the envelope. He picked it up, tore it open, and read the note. His face turned red. "Who do they think they are?" he shouted to no one. "I am the owner. I own this penthouse. I can do whatever I want." He crumpled the heavy cardstock into a ball. Then, with a sneer of pure arrogance, he opened the front door and threw the paper ball at the retreating back of the staff member down the hall. He did not just throw it away. He ripped the follow-up notice regarding the facade maintenance fee into shreds and let the pieces fall onto the corridor carpet. It was a small act of rebellion, but it was fatal. The hallway camera, positioned discreetly above the emergency exit sign, captured the entire tantrum in high resolution. It recorded the new owner of the penthouse littering in the common area and destroying official building correspondence. I saved the clip. I labeled it evidence_exhibit_B_noncompliance. Julian slammed the door shut, retreating into his freezing fortress. He thought he had made a statement. He thought he was showing the world he was the boss. He had no idea that he had just handed Nemesis Holdings the first verifiable grounds for a breach of contract suit. He was not the king of the castle. He was a rat in a maze, and I had just closed the first gate behind him. The hangover from the housewarming party had not even begun to fade when Julian put on his best suit and marched out of the penthouse. It was 11 a.m. on a Tuesday. I watched him leave via the lobby camera, a leather portfolio tucked under his arm. Inside that portfolio was the deed to the apartment. He was heading to the bank, specifically the downtown branch of Sovereign Trust, to cash in his winning lottery ticket. He believed he was about to walk out with a line of credit worth $2 million. He had likely already spent the first $100,000 in his head. I did not need a camera inside the bank manager's office to know what happened next. I knew the banking regulations better than I knew my own face. I sat in my office at Nemesis Holdings, a small, nondescript room in a shared workspace across town, and waited for the inevitable explosion. It took exactly 45 minutes. When Julian returned to the penthouse, he did not strut. He stormed. He kicked the front door open, threw his portfolio across the room, and immediately dialed a number on his phone, putting it on speaker. The high-fidelity audio sensors in the living room picked up every ragged breath. "Pick up! Pick up! You useless hack!" Julian hissed. Finally, a voice answered. It was Derek Thorne. "Julian?" Thorne asked. "How did it go? Did you get the liquidity?" They laughed at me. "Derek!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking. "The loan officer literally laughed at me. They denied the application. They said the property is toxic. That is impossible," Thorne soothed, though I could hear the rustling of papers in the background. "The title is clean. Your sister signed the quitclaim." "It is not clean," Julian yelled. "They said there is a primary lien on the property. A priority creditor called Nemesis Holdings has a claim that supersedes any new mortgage. They said the asset has zero equity available for leveraging because it is tied up in a commercial liability agreement. What the hell is Nemesis Holdings? And why do they own my apartment?" I leaned back in my chair, a cold smile touching my lips. This was the moment the trap snapped shut. "Let me check the file," Thorne said, his voice losing its arrogant polish. He sounded frantic. "Hang on, I am looking at the transfer addendum now." I thought it was just the standard boilerplate for the smart home system handover. There was a long silence on the line. I imagined Thorne reading the document properly for the first time, the blood draining from his face as he realized what he had let his client sign. "Oh," Thorne whispered. "Oh?" Julian mocked. "That is all you have?" "Oh?" "Julian," Thorne said, his tone grave. "Did you read Exhibit C of the transfer agreement? The section titled, Assumption of Outstanding and Future Liabilities?" "No," Julian shouted. "You told me to just sign it. You said it was just about the furniture." Thorne cleared his throat. "It appears that by accepting the title, you also accepted the existing service contract with the building management firm, Nemesis Holdings. This contract, good Lord, this contract stipulates a special maintenance assessment for the penthouse unit." "How much?" Julian demanded. $50,000, Thorne said weakly. "Per month." Julian went silent. The number hung in the air like a guillotine blade. $50,000 a month. $600,000 a year. It was an absurdity, a number I had invented specifically because I knew it was impossible for him to pay. "And there is more," Thorne continued, sounding like a man reading his own obituary, "because the deed was transferred to you as an individual, and you have not lived in the state for the requisite 2 years to claim residency status for tax purposes. The property has been reclassified. It is no longer taxed as a primary residence. It is taxed as a short-term investment vehicle. The property tax rate just tripled. It is retroactive to the beginning of the fiscal year." Julian sank onto the sofa, the same sofa his friends had spilled wine on the night before. "So I cannot borrow money against the house," he said, his voice trembling. "And now I owe how much?" Before Thorne could answer, my computer pinged. It was time for the second blow. I hit the send button on the email drafted by Nemesis Holdings, in the penthouse. Julian's phone chimed with a priority notification. He looked down at the screen. "What is this?" he whispered. It was a demand letter. It stated that per the contract he had signed, the new owner was required to pay the first 6 months of the special assessment fee up front upon taking possession, $300,000. Julian read aloud, his voice barely a squeak. "Due immediately. Failure to remit payment within 24 hours will result in the suspension of all building services, including electricity, water, and access to the private elevator. 300,000? Thorne choked over the speakerphone. "Julian, do you have that kind of cash?" "I have $400 in my checking account," Julian screamed, throwing the phone at the wall. My own phone began to buzz instantly. It was my mother, then my father, then my mother again. They were calling to scream, to accuse, to demand I fix the mess I had engineered. I watched the screen light up. name after name, and simply flipped the phone face down. I was not a crisis manager today. I was a spectator. Inside the penthouse, the reality of the situation was setting in. Julian was pacing like a caged animal. He was trapped between a bank that wouldn't lend to him, a tax bill that would bankrupt him, and a management company that was about to turn off his lights. He needed money, fast. Cash that didn't leave a paper trail. Cash that could keep the wolves at bay for just a few more days while he figured something out. His eyes darted around the room and landed on the wall safe. "No," I whispered, leaning closer to my monitor. "Do it. Make the bad decision." Julian walked over to the safe. He punched in the code. He pulled out the velvet box containing the emeralds. "Thorn," Julian shouted toward his phone, which was lying on the floor but still connected. "I have the jewelry. The emeralds. Mom said they were appraised at $200,000 a few years ago. You cannot sell those through a legitimate auction house quickly." Thorn's voice tinny and distant. "The paperwork takes weeks. I am not going to an auction house," Julian said, shoving the box into his jacket pocket. "I know a guy in Chinatown. He runs a pawn shop that handles high-value items. He does not ask questions. He will give me 50 cents on the dollar, but it is cash. That will cover the maintenance fee and get the power kept on. Do not do anything rash." "Julian," Thorn warned. "I have no choice," Julian yelled. He grabbed his keys. "I am going now." He ran out of the apartment. I sat back, my heart pounding a steady, rhythmic beat against my ribs. This was it. The financial trap was devastating, but it was civil. What he was about to do was criminal. I picked up my burner phone, a prepaid device I had bought specifically for this call. I dialed a number I had memorized weeks ago. It was the direct line to the Cultural Heritage Crime Unit of the San Francisco Police Department, Detective Miller. I said when the gruff voice answered, "I would like to report a theft in progress." "Yes, the suspect is moving a registered state heritage asset. He is heading toward Chinatown. I have the description of the items and the suspect's vehicle plate number." I gave them the details. I told them exactly where he was going, a location I knew because Julian had bragged about his fence connections during a Thanksgiving dinner 2 years ago. I hung up the phone and destroyed the SIM card. Julian thought he was racing to save his lifestyle. He did not realize he was racing toward a felony indictment. The financial ruin was just the opening act. The real show was about to begin in the back room of a pawn shop. The collapse of my brother's world was not a singular event but a cascade. A series of dominoes falling with increasing velocity. While I watched from the safety of my remote command center, Derek Thorne was frantically trying to salvage the wreckage in his high-rise office. I knew exactly what he was doing because my lawyer, Lydia Sterling, was receiving his increasingly desperate emails. Thorne was attempting to void the transfer. He was drafting a lawsuit claiming that I had acted in bad faith, that I had obfuscated the terms of the agreement, and that I had coerced my family into a trap. It was a standard defense for the incompetent. However, the law does not protect people who decline to read what they sign. Lydia had replied to his initial threat with a single attachment. It was a digital copy of the transfer agreement, with specific paragraphs highlighted in neon yellow. Paragraph 14. Subsection B clearly stated the existence of the commercial management contract. Paragraph 20 clearly outlined the fee structure. Paragraph 30 explicitly waived the right to claim ignorance of any attached schedules. I had not hidden anything. I had simply bet on their arrogance, and they had paid out. But Thorne soon discovered that the contract was the least of his problems. According to the intelligence I gathered from the audio bugs still recording in the penthouse, Thorne had summoned Julian to his office early that morning. Before the pawn shop run, Julian had confessed a secret that even I had not fully anticipated. It turned out that Julian had not just planned to get a bank loan. He had already leveraged the penthouse before he even owned it. He had shown the unsigned deed to a private lender, a polite term for a loan shark, to secure a bridge loan of $200,000 to cover his gambling losses from the previous month. He had promised this shark that he would hand over the second lien on the property within 48 hours of the transfer. Now, Julian was trapped in a three-way vice. Nemesis Holdings held the primary claim and was demanding $300,000. The bank had refused to refinance, and a man with a very violent reputation was expecting a lien on a property that was now legally toxic. Thorne had screamed at him. I heard it on the recording. He told Julian that his only option was to sell the apartment immediately, even at a loss, to pay everyone off. But who would buy it? Who would buy a penthouse with a $50,000 monthly maintenance fee, a restrictive commercial management contract, and a pending lawsuit? It was an unsellable asset. It was a concrete block tied around his ankles in the middle of the ocean. That was the pressure that had sent Julian running to Chinatown with my grandmother's emeralds. I switched my attention to the police scanner feed I had been monitoring. At 1 p.m, the call came through. The pawn shop was a dusty, narrow establishment on Grant Avenue, the kind of place that displayed cameras and gold chains in the window, but made its real money in the back room. Julian had walked in, sweating and manic, and slammed the velvet box onto the counter. He demanded $50,000 cash. The pawnbroker, a man who knew the smell of desperation, had offered him 20. Julian had screamed, argued, and eventually agreed. He was just reaching for the stack of bills when the front door was kicked open. The tip I had phoned in to Detective Miller was precise. I had described the suspect, the location, and most importantly, the specific items. But the police did not just arrest him for selling stolen goods. When the officers secured the scene, they ran the serial numbers of the emerald brooches against the database I had updated days ago. They popped up immediately. Status: disputed estate asset, active probate litigation. This was the second knife I had twisted, immediately after signing the deed transferring the chattels to Julian. Lydia had filed a motion in probate court on my behalf. We claimed that we had discovered a copy of my grandmother's true will, a copy my parents had conveniently suppressed, which clearly stated the emeralds were to be held in trust. Not owned outright, because the ownership was now legally disputed. Julian had no right to sell them, by attempting to convert them into cash. He was committing theft of an estate asset and trafficking in restricted cultural goods. The police confiscated the emeralds. They handcuffed Julian in front of a crowd of tourists. He was not just broke. He was now in the system. My parents received the call an hour later. They did not have the cash for his bail, which was set high due to the flight risk and the value of the goods. They had to make a choice, to save their son from spending the night in a holding cell. They had to liquidate their own safety net. I monitored the stock market transactions. My father panic sold a significant portion of his retirement portfolio, blue-chip stocks he had held for decades, at a market low. He took a massive tax hit and lost 20% of the value just to get the cash liquid within hours. They were bleeding money to stop a hemorrhage I had started. By the time Julian was released, looking haggard and terrified, the sun had set. But the war was not over. Derek Thorne, realizing his career was in jeopardy if he continued to represent a client who was actively committing felonies, demanded a meeting with Lydia. He wanted to negotiate a settlement. He wanted to plead for mercy. They met at a neutral location, a conference room in a hotel downtown. I was not there, but Lydia recorded the session for me. Thorne looked exhausted. He slid a folder across the table. "We are willing to return the penthouse," Thorne said, his voice stripped of its usual bravado. "Julian will sign a quitclaim back to Ruth. We just want the debt canceled. We want Nemesis Holdings to waive the fees, and we want the police charges dropped." Lydia did not touch the folder. She sat back, crossed her legs, and smiled the smile of a shark sensing blood in the water. "That is not how this works. Derek," she said softly, "you do not get to return the car after you have driven it off a cliff." She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a binder. It was 3 inches thick. "Ruth does not want the apartment back." Lydia continued, "She wants justice, and she wants you to know exactly who you are protecting." She opened the binder. Inside was the forensic accounting report on Julian's shell companies. It detailed the money laundering, the tax evasion, and the wire fraud. But then, she turned the page to the section that concerned my parents. We also have evidence regarding the original probate of Ruth's grandmother, Lydia said. Thorne frowned. That was 5 years ago. Statute of limitations for fraud does not apply when there is concealment. Lydia countered. We have a handwriting analysis expert who is prepared to testify that the signature on the waiver Ruth supposedly signed 5 years ago, the one that allowed her parents to access her portion of the trust, was a forgery. A forgery committed by her parents. Thorne went pale. He picked up the document, his hands trembling. If this goes to court, Lydia said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper, your client goes to federal prison for money laundering. His parents go to prison for fraud and embezzlement. And you, Derek? If you continue to shield them knowing this, you will be disbarred for facilitating a criminal enterprise. Thorne looked up. The arrogance was gone. In its place was the terrifying realization that he was standing in the blast radius of a bomb that had already detonated. This is not a negotiation, Lydia said, closing the binder with a sharp snap. This is a notification. You are on the wrong side of history. Derek, I suggest you decide how much of your own reputation you are willing to burn to keep them warm. Thorne stood up. He did not say a word. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the room, leaving the settlement offer untouched on the table. He knew, just as I knew, that the game had changed. It was no longer about money, it was about survival. The fallout from Julian's arrest was swift, brutal, and entirely public. News of the incident at the pawn shop had leaked to the local blogs. Likely aided by the detailed police report I had ensured was filed correctly. By the next morning, the sharks were circling. But these were not the loan sharks Julian feared. These were the legitimate creditors who realized their investment was circling the drain. My parents' suburban home in Palo Alto, usually a sanctuary of manicured lawns and polite silence, was under siege. Process servers and debt collectors, men in cheap suits with aggressive knocks, were showing up at their door. They were looking for Julian. But since he had listed our parents' address as his permanent residence on half his fraudulent loan applications, the trouble came home to roost. Overwhelmed and panicked, my parents did what they always did. They came to blame me. They stormed into the lobby of Oakmont Valuations at 10 in the morning. My receptionist looked terrified as my father slammed his hand on the desk, demanding to see me. I did not hide. I instructed security to escort them to Conference Room B, a glass-walled enclosure in the center of the floor. I wanted transparency. I wanted there to be no shadows for them to hide in. When I entered the room, my mother looked 10 years older than she had the day before. Her mascara was smudged, and her hands were trembling. "You did this!" she screamed, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You set him up. Ruth! You knew about the heritage laws. You knew he would try to sell the jewelry because he had no cash. You trapped your own brother." I sat down at the head of the table, my expression impassive. I did not set him up. "Mother, I gave him a house and a fortune in jewels. The fact that his first instinct was to commit a felony to pay off gambling debts is not my design. It is his character. He is just a boy," my father roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. "He made a mistake. He was desperate because you strangled him with those fees. And now you are going to fix it. You are going to drop the lawsuit, call the police to retract your statement, and wire him the money to pay off the management company." I looked at them. They truly believed it. They truly believed Julian was a victim of circumstance, a martyr on the altar of my jealousy. I picked up the remote control on the table. "Before we discuss any solutions," I said, my voice cold and hard, "there is something you need to see." I pointed the remote at the large monitor on the wall. The screen flickered to life. It was footage from the Penthouse living room, recorded 3 nights ago, just hours after Julian had moved in. On the screen, Julian was sprawling on the sofa, a bottle of wine in one hand. His girlfriend was sitting on the floor, counting a stack of cash, money he had likely skimmed from the very loan sharks he was now running from. The audio was crystal clear. "Your parents are going to be so annoying about coming over here," the girl complained. Julian laughed. A cruel, ugly sound. "Don't worry about them. Once I figure out how to leverage the equity in this place, I'm going to put them in a home." "A home?" the girl asked. "Yeah, a nursing home. Shady Pines or whatever." Julian sneered. "They are just two old cash cows that I've been milking for years. But the milk is running dry. They are exhausting. As soon as I secure the bag, I am cutting them off. They can rot in a facility for all I care. I will tell them it is for their own good." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence in the conference room was absolute. It was a physical weight, pressing down on our lungs. I looked at my parents. My mother had collapsed into a chair, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. My father was staring at the blank screen, his mouth slightly open, as if he had been struck by a physical blow. The son they had sacrificed everything for, the boy they had neglected me to pamper, viewed them as nothing more than livestock to be drained and discarded. I stood up and walked to the window. "I did not destroy him," I said softly, not looking at them. "You did. You watered the weeds and pulled up the flowers. You taught him that there were no consequences. You taught him that he could take, and you would always give. Well, he is done taking." My father's phone rang. The sound made everyone jump. He pulled it out with shaking hands. It was Derek Thorne. My father put it on speaker. Perhaps out of habit, or perhaps because he no longer had the strength to hold the phone to his ear. "Mr. Vance," Thorne's voice was high-pitched, bordering on hysterical. "We have a major problem." "What now?" my father whispered. "The district attorney's office just contacted me," Thorne said, "because of the amount of money moving through Julian's accounts, and the fact that he used your retirement accounts to cover his bail. The prosecutors are widening the scope. They are looking at your tax returns. Mr. Vance, they suspect you might be complicit in the money laundering scheme. They are subpoenaing your bank records going back 10 years. My father dropped the phone. It clattered onto the glass table. The color drained from his face until he looked like a corpse. It wasn't over. While they sat there, paralyzed by the destruction of their reputation, my own phone buzzed with an alert from the security team at Obsidian Heights. I checked the notification. Subject: Incident Report, Lobby. Suspect: Julian Vance. I tapped the live feed and cast it to the main monitor so my parents could see the finale. Julian, having been bailed out by my parents that morning, had returned to the penthouse. He was wearing the same clothes he had been arrested in. He looked deranged. He was standing at the elevator bank, slamming his keycard against the reader. The light flashed red. Denied, denied, denied. Nemesis Holdings had exercised its right under the criminal conduct clause of the lease. We had revoked his access privileges pending the eviction hearing. On the screen, Julian snapped. He started kicking the elevator doors. He picked up a heavy ceramic vase from the concierge desk and hurled it through the glass partition of the mailroom. "I own this place!" He was screaming, the audio distortion making him sound like a demon. "Open the door!" 2 large security guards, men I had personally hired for exactly this scenario, moved in. They did not hesitate. One of them tackled Julian. Pinning him to the marble floor, Julian thrashed and bit, screaming profanities. Within minutes, the police arrived. These were not the polite officers from the Heritage Unit. These were patrol cops responding to a violent disturbance. They hauled Julian up, cuffed him, and dragged him out of the building. He was being arrested for the second time in 24 hours. This time for felony vandalism and disturbing the peace. This time, there would be no bail. He had violated the conditions of his previous release. I turned off the monitor. My mother slid off the chair and onto her knees. It was a pathetic sight. The woman who had once looked at me with such disdain was now grasping the hem of my skirt. "Ruth, please," she sobbed. "Please stop this. He will go to prison for years. He will die in there. You have the power to stop it. Tell the management company to drop the charges. Tell the police it was a misunderstanding. We will do anything. Anything." I looked down at her. I felt no pity. I felt only the cold clarity of a transaction being finalized. "Anything?" I asked. "Yes," my father cried, tears running down his face. "Anything. I walked over to the recording device on the table, a dictaphone I used for client meetings. I pressed the record button. The red light blinked steady and unblinking. "Then you will tell the truth," I said. "Not about Julian, about Nana Rose." My parents froze. "I want you to admit it," I continued, my voice level. "I want you to admit that 5 years ago, you forged my signature on a waiver document. I want you to admit that you intercepted the trust fund my grandmother left for me and diverted the funds into your own accounts to pay for Julian's failed businesses." They stared at me in horror. They thought that secret was buried deep in the past. "If you confess, on the record, right now, I will ask Nemesis Holdings to decline to press charges for the lobby damage. It might reduce his sentence. If you do not, I will hand this file over to the forensic accountants who are already looking at your taxes." My father looked at my mother. They communicated in a silent look of defeat. They were cornered. "Start talking." I said, "State your names and the date." My father took a shuddering breath. He leaned toward the microphone. "My name is Robert Vance," he rasped. "It is February 5th, 2026. 5 years ago, we took the money. I listened as they detailed the theft. Every dollar they stole from me, every lie they told. I watched the recording tapes spin, capturing their confession, capturing the final death of the family I had once tried so hard to please. When they finished, I stopped the recording. I took the tape out and put it in my pocket. "Thank you," I said. I turned and walked out of the conference room, leaving them alone in the glass box, surrounded by the ruins of the life they had built on lies. The air in the San Francisco Superior Courtroom was stale and smelled faintly of floor wax and desperation. I sat at the plaintiff's table next to Lydia Sterling, my spine pressed against the hard wood of the chair. Across the aisle, the defense table looked like a portrait of ruin. Julian sat slumped in an orange jumpsuit, his wrists cuffed to the table, looking less like the master of the universe he claimed to be and more like a frightened child. My parents sat in the gallery directly behind him, their faces pale and drawn, holding hands as if bracing for a tsunami. Derek Thorne stood at the podium. He was sweating. The confident, arrogant shark who had sneered at me in his high-rise office a week ago was gone. In his place was a man fighting for his professional life. "Your Honor," Thorne began, his voice wavering slightly before he cleared his throat to steady it. "We are moving to vacate the transfer of the property located at Obsidian Heights and to dismiss the associated debt obligations. We argue that the contract signed by my client, Julian Vance, was unconscionable. It was a predatory instrument designed by the plaintiff, his own sister, to entrap a sophisticated but trusting individual." He gestured dramatically toward me. "Ms. Oakmont used her superior knowledge of real estate law and complex financial instruments to construct a trap." Thorne continued. "She hid material facts regarding the maintenance fees and the tax implications in obscure addendums. She acted in bad faith. Your Honor, she knew my client could not possibly meet these obligations. This was not a business transaction. It was a personal vendetta masquerading as a property transfer." I kept my face impassive, though inside I was smiling. Thorne was playing the victim card. It was a desperate play. Judge Harrington, a woman with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every variety of liar the city had to offer, peered over her glasses at Thorne. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dry and sharp, "you were present at the signing of this contract. Were you not?" Thorne hesitated. "Yes, Your Honor, I was, and you are a licensed attorney in the state of California, specializing in family law and asset protection?" "Yes, Your Honor." "So," the judge continued, leaning forward, "are you telling this court that you advised your client to sign a document that you found to be obscure? Or are you telling me that you did not read the document yourself? Because neither option paints you or your argument in a favorable light." Thorne turned a shade of red that clashed with his tie. My client was under emotional duress. He stammered, "The family pressure—" The judge cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Your client is 29 years old. Mr. Thorne, he is not a minor. He is not mentally incapacitated. He is an adult male who accepted a $2.5 million asset if he failed to read the terms of the maintenance fees. That is a failure of due diligence, not a legal defense for invalidating a contract. Motion to vacate based on unconscionability is denied. Thorne slumped against the podium. He had lost the first round. But he wasn't done. However, Your Honor. Thorne pivoted, trying to regain his footing. We also argue that the penalties enforced by the management company, Nemesis Holdings, are punitive and illegal. They are charging $50,000 a month for maintenance. This is extortion. We demand that the plaintiff reveal the ownership structure of Nemesis Holdings. We believe it is merely an alter ego of Ms. Oakmont herself, used to defraud my client. Lydia stood up. She smoothed her skirt and walked to the podium with the grace of a predator entering a clearing. She carried a single, thin file folder. We are happy to address the ownership of Nemesis Holdings. Your Honor, Lydia said, her voice cool and projecting to the back of the room. In fact, it is central to the plaintiff's cross-complaint regarding fraud and misappropriation of funds. Lydia opened the folder and placed a document on the judge's bench. Mr. Thorne asserts that Nemesis Holdings is a shell company designed to profit Miss Oakmont personally. Lydia stated, that is factually incorrect. Nemesis Holdings is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Rose Vance Memorial Foundation. I heard my mother gasp in the gallery. The name of her mother, my grandmother, hung in the air like a ghost. The Rose Vance Memorial Foundation, Lydia continued, is a registered 501c3 charitable organization. Its mission is to provide housing grants for underprivileged art students and to preserve historical cultural assets in the Bay Area. Ms. Oakmont is merely the unpaid executive director. She derives zero financial benefit from the company. Lydia turned to look directly at Julian, whose eyes were wide with confusion and fear. The $50,000 monthly fee was not a random number. Lydia explained, it was the calculated projected revenue required to fund the Foundation's scholarship program for the coming fiscal year. When Mr. Vance signed the agreement to take over the property, he was not just agreeing to pay a management company, he was legally binding himself to fund a charity. The courtroom was silent. Even the court stenographer paused for a fraction of a second. Lydia drove the final nail into the coffin. Therefore, Your Honor, when Mr. Vance attempted to leverage the property to secure a high-interest loan from a non-institutional lender, a loan shark, and when he attempted to sell the emeralds, which are also registered assets of this same foundation, he was not just cheating his sister, he was attempting to defraud a registered charity. He was embezzling funds designated for at-risk students. This constitutes a severe breach of the public trust and elevates the nature of his financial crime significantly. I watched Thorne. The blood had drained completely from his face. He looked at the document Lydia had submitted. Then he looked at Julian. He realized in that second that he was not defending a hapless victim of a family feud. He was defending a man who had tried to rob a dead woman's charity. Thorne turned to the judge. Your Honor, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I need a moment. I was not made aware of the charitable status of the holding company. You may have a brief recess, Judge Harrington said, looking at Thorne with open pity. 10 minutes. Thorne grabbed Julian by the arm of his orange jumpsuit. Officer, bring him to the consultation room. Now. They disappeared into the side room. My parents rushed to follow them, but the bailiff blocked their path. They stood there, helpless, pressing their ears against the heavy wood door. We did not need to press our ears against the door. The shouting was audible even through the soundproofing. You lied to me, we heard Thorne scream. You told me it was a family shell company. You did not tell me I was helping you steal from a charity. Do you have any idea what this does to my license? I didn't know, Julian's voice wailed back. She never told me. Because you never asked, Thorne roared. You were too busy trying to buy a G-Wagon to read the damn paperwork. I looked at Lydia. She was calmly organizing her papers, arranging them in a neat stack. He is done, she whispered to me. Thorne is going to walk. A moment later, The door to the consultation room opened. Thorne stepped out. He looked like he had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He adjusted his tie, but his hands were shaking so badly he couldn't get the knot straight. He walked back into the courtroom alone, leaving Julian inside with the guard. Thorne approached the bench as the judge banged the gavel to resume the session. "Mr. Thorne?" Judge Harrington asked. "Are you ready to proceed?" Thorne took a deep breath. He looked at me, then at my parents, and finally at the empty chair where his client should have been. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice shaking but distinct. In light of the new evidence regarding the nature of the plaintiff entity and the conflicting information provided to me by my client regarding his financial intent, I must regretfully move to withdraw as counsel for Mr. Vance. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. "On what grounds?" the judge asked, though she clearly already knew. Irreconcilable conflict of interest, Thorne stated, and a fundamental breakdown in the attorney-client privilege regarding the disclosure of criminal intent. "I cannot ethically represent a client who has utilized my services to facilitate the defrauding of a charitable institution." My parents let out a collective sob. Without a lawyer. Julian was defenseless. Permission granted. Judge Harrington said, banging the gavel, "Mr. Thorne, you are excused. Mr. Vance will be remanded to custody until he can secure new counsel or be assigned a public defender, given the severity of the new revelations regarding the charity fraud. I am also revoking any possibility of bail." Thorne did not look back. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing like gunshots. He walked past my parents without even acknowledging their existence. He knew his career was hanging by a thread, and he was cutting the dead weight loose to save himself. I looked at the consultation room door as the bailiff went in to retrieve Julian. The game was over. The king had been toppled, the knights had fled, and all that was left were the pawns, waiting to be swept off the board. Derek Thorne stood before the bench, the microphone trembling slightly in his grip. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. He did not look at me. He did not look at the judge. He looked like a man trying to outrun an avalanche, and he had just decided that the only way to survive was to push someone else into its path. "Your Honor," Thorne said, his voice echoing through the speakers, distinct and final. "Based on the new evidence provided regarding the true origin of the assets and the undeniable behavior of my client, I must formally request to withdraw from this case immediately due to a severe and irreconcilable moral conflict of interest." The courtroom erupted. It wasn't a murmur this time. It was a gasp that sucked the air out of the room. Julian, realizing his last line of defense had just abandoned him, surged forward in his chair, straining against the handcuffs. "You traitor!" Julian screamed, his face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. "You work for me. I pay you. You cannot just walk away." Thorne turned around. For the first time all day, he looked directly at the Vance family. He did not look apologetic. He looked furious. "I was not paid enough to participate in a family fraud ring and the falsification of legal documents," Thorne shouted, his voice booming over Julian's screams, ensuring the court reporter caught every syllable. "You people lied to me. You lied about the solvency of the estate. You lied about the ownership of the artifacts. I am an officer of the court, and I will not let you drag my license down with your sinking ship." That was the kill shot. The confession of the opposing counsel that his own clients were liars was the most damning piece of evidence imaginable. Judge Harrington banged her gavel. Once, twice, 3 times. The sound was like a gunshot terminating the chaos. "Order!" she commanded. "Mr. Vance, sit down, or you will be held in contempt." Julian collapsed back into his chair, panting, his eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. He looked at our parents, but they were frozen, staring at Thorne in horror. They knew what this meant. If the lawyer was running, the game was over. The judge adjusted her glasses and looked down at the paperwork Lydia had submitted. She did not need to deliberate. The facts were not just clear, they were overwhelming. "The court has heard enough," Judge Harrington stated. her voice icy. The motion to vacate the property transfer is denied. Furthermore, finding clear evidence of bad faith and fraudulent inducement on the part of the defendant, the court hereby rules in favor of the plaintiff. Nemesis Holdings. She looked at Julian with profound disdain. The ownership of the penthouse at Obsidian Heights is hereby reverted to Nemesis Holdings, effective immediately, due to catastrophic breach of contract and criminal misuse of the property. Mr. Vance, you are ordered to pay all outstanding legal fees and the cost of damages to the building lobby. But I don't have any money, Julian wailed, the tears finally coming. They took everything. That is a matter for the bankruptcy court, Judge Harrington said dismissively. Bailiff, take Mr. Vance into custody. The district attorney has requested he be remanded immediately to face charges of bank fraud, trafficking in stolen heritage goods, and violation of his previous bail conditions. 2 officers moved in on Julian. They hauled him up by his armpits. He did not fight this time. He just sagged, a broken puppet whose strings had been cut. Mom! Dad! Do something! He cried out as they dragged him toward the side door. My father stood up, his legs shaking. Your Honor, please, he is our son. Sit down. Mr. Vance, the judge snapped. Unless you wish to join him, I have already forwarded the transcript of today's proceedings, along with the recording provided by the plaintiff regarding the trust fund embezzlement, to the prosecutor's office. I suggest you and your wife find very good criminal defense attorneys. You are going to need them. My parents collapsed onto the bench, clutching each other. They watched as their golden boy was led away in cuffs, weeping like a toddler. Then they turned their eyes to me. Ruth, my mother whispered, her voice broken. How could you? We are your family. I stood up. I smoothed the lapel of my jacket. I looked at them, really looked at them. For the last time, I saw the fear in their eyes. But I also saw the same selfishness that had always been there. Even now, facing prison, they were blaming me for not letting them rob me. I did not say a word. There was nothing left to say. The tape recorder in my pocket had said it all. I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle of the courtroom, my heels clicking a steady rhythm on the floor. I could hear my mother sobbing behind me, a sound that used to tear my heart out, but now sounded like distant static. I pushed open the heavy double doors and stepped out into the hallway. The air was cooler here, cleaner. Lydia was waiting for me by the exit. She didn't smile, but she gave me a sharp, respectful nod. Is it done? She asked. It is done, I replied. We walked out of the courthouse together, stepping into the bright, blinding sunshine of a San Francisco afternoon. The city looked different today. The fog had lifted. The sky was a piercing, impossible blue. My car was waiting at the curb, the black sedan gleaming in the light. The driver opened the rear door for me. I paused before getting in. I reached into my purse and pulled out my phone. I saw 3 missed calls from my father and a long, rambling text message from my mother begging for a meeting. I tapped the screen. Block contact. I did the same for my father. Block contact. Then, I went to my contacts list and deleted their names entirely. I slid into the back seat of the car, the leather cool against my legs. I put on my dark sunglasses, shielding my eyes from the glare. Where to? Ms. Oakmont? The driver asked. Meeting my eyes in the rearview mirror, I looked out the window at the skyline. Somewhere up there, in a glass tower, a penthouse was empty, waiting for a worthy owner, but that was business for next week. To the airport, I said, leaning back and closing my eyes. I have a vacation in the Maldives to enjoy. The car pulled away from the curb, merging into the traffic, leaving the courthouse and the wreckage of the Vance family far behind in the dust. The screen fades to black. Thank you so much for listening to this story of cold justice and absolute retribution. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening from a busy subway in New York, a quiet room in London, or somewhere else entirely? Please drop a comment below and let me know your location and your thoughts on Ruth's revenge. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel Blue Payback, like this video, And hit that hype button to help this story get recommended to more people who love a good drama. Your support means the world to us. Stay tuned for the next Payback.